Chapter 1 World Bridge by Hydesgrain. There was a single inhabitable planet called Argos, revolving around the humongous sun with dozens of gaseous planets filling the stellar system. The planet flourished until the intelligent bipedal race was able to socialize, gathered up to survive, and advance with the help of each other. Over hundreds of years, humanity was able to generate energy to mechanize, automize machines and prospered. Humanity's history was short compared to the history of the whole planet, but they used up more limited natural resources than any other race ever did before. Argos was humongous, but the population of the human race broke through the 3-digit billions as if it was nothing, and humanity's living space reached its limits with its construction abilities. After an additional 100 years, they had to leave the solar system to find new planets to continue the growth and advancement, but it was easier said than done, as the speed of light and theories weren't easy to achieve, which was one essential requirement to leave the solar system to explore new solar systems. Many humans even prayed to whoever god they wanted to, that something would change and they would make a breakthrough in space traveling. Years passed and a sudden meteor shower shocked humanity to the bones as the furthest planet on the same stellar system was pierced by them, shattering into millions of pieces without any efforts. The meteor shower's appearance and disappearance happened in an extremely short span of time, but the most important known fact was that the meteor shower came from outside the solar system without anyone noticing it. One could say humanity's prayers were answered as scientists picked up a few remains of the meteorites, which were made out of an unknown material never seen before. The meteor radiated cold but tranquil energy, causing the tense surrounding to release their tension subconsciously. This energy was much more powerful than any energy ever invented by humanity, and it was even stronger than nature's laws, as it made the meteorite float slightly in the air. Researching the meteorite, many things were found out. For example, the radiating energy from the meteorites could accelerate the growing speed of plants and animals around them. The scientists researching the meteorite felt more vigorous, slowly grew stronger, and it even looked like their aging speed decelerated, which made the other humans envious. One day, years after the first research about the meteorite began, cracks began to spread over the meteorite's surface without any warning signs, and an unmeasurable amount of the still unknown energy began to condense into a blue shining liquid-like ball that peeled its outer stone skin and ascended into the sky. While most humans around the world were still working, nature felt a sudden fate-changing event and the whole wildlife went silent. Only humans at the other side of the planet, far away from the laboratory, didn't feel anything. The blue shining ball with the accumulated mysterious energy continued its ascension until it reached a certain height where it floated parallel, without moving a single inch. All humans around the laboratory were anxious and horrified because of the unknown. It caused the goosebumps, and they imagined dreadful scenarios without being able to do anything at all. Some humans with a weaker person start crying, while others hug each other trying to find comfort, and others could only stare into the sky with a blank mind, not being able to think straight. The liquid light seemed to get stronger, as a suction force spread around it while its size decreased over time. Distancing themselves from the suction force that seemed to get stronger over time, mankind could only look high into the sky. The amount of compressed energy inside this tennis ball-sized blue shining ball was huge enough to devastate at least half of the continent, if not the whole planet. Time passed and the scientists suddenly noticed a surprising change with the blue shining ball, causing them to get more nervous. Luckily, the energy was floating tranquil and stable until it reached the size of a ping-pong ball. The compressed energy was getting more and more unstable after reaching a certain threshold, and it trembled violently, terrifying the surrounding humans. At this moment, even the humans on the other side of Argos noticed that something was wrong, and the whole livelihood of the planet tensed up, not being able to move freely. It was as if the planet itself was under threat by the single little energy ball, as nature was as quiet as never before in its history, billions of years. Space seemed to twist suddenly, and blood-red cobweb-like cracks formed below the energy ball, leading the energy ball to a more stable constitution. The more cracks appeared, the less violent was the energy ball, seemingly getting more stable, and some hands sighed in relief. Not only did these cracks appear close to the blue shining ball, rather these cracks appeared all around Argos, in the ocean, inside the jungle, underground, even high in the sky, almost everywhere one could think of. Nobody knew exactly what to think about the sudden cracks they could see in the sky, but from the looks of it, there was no way it could have been something good. On one side they felt relieved that the blue shining every ball didn't explode, while on the other side the red cracks didn't seem to be something one wanted to have on one's planet either. The crack all over the planet grew in size until they reached a certain magnitude. Some were bigger while others were small in size, but all of them had one particular fact in common. While its frame was blood red, space inside was pitch black, without letting a single sunray lighten up the meteor. It looked like the way to the abyss, and it frightened the living being around the cracks. Right at this moment, one of the worst scenarios the scientists feared happened in front of them. The seemingly stable energy continued to compress itself, causing it to implode. Devastating amounts of mysterious energy were released, causing the blood red cracks to space around additionally. Surprisingly, the enormous amount of energy didn't devastate the landscape, rather than that it enveloped the whole planet with its blue shining color before invading every living being and the planet itself until it reached the core. Not a single cell was spared, and the whole planet jolted, creating earthquakes and tsunamis, volcanic outbreaks, as it was invaded by the unknown energy. Unknowingly to humanity, Argos shackles from billions of years ago were released and its core was resurrected. The former pitch-black abyss, like the inside of the blood-red cracks, changed into hundreds of different colorful landscapes. While many of these landscapes looked beautiful with majestic mountains, lively forest, and clean oceans, the sight of other cracks wasn't as joyful and be as mankind thought a moment before. Hideous-looking creatures with razor-sharp teeth, thick scales, massive tails and bloodthirsty in their eyes stepped through a certain crack, while various other dreadful beings entered Argos through the various cracks. Bridge between different worlds appeared, and Argos entered a new dark age of devastation and death. Chapter 2: Dead Eyes by Hydesgrain. Jason, tell us about the chronicles right after the Dark Age began. A deep but somehow scholarly voice resounded inside the small classroom. A young 13-year-old boy stood up from his chair with a straight back facing the front without looking anywhere in particular, as he began to narrate the events from 300 years ago. 300 years ago, the invasion of foreign races and wild beasts began because the mana outbreak that occurred during this time. The mana outbreak created rifts to other planes that linked them with Argos for some reason we don't know. In the beginning, humanity was unaware of the invasion of foreign races. They were still shocked by the mysterious energy explosion and creation of blood-red cracks with landscapes behind them. Later on, news about the appearance of tall, bulky and humanoid-like race with huge wings, raven-like heads and medieval Lulamji weapons overshadowed the explosion of the overly compressed mana ball with the invasion of the unknown energy we now call mana inside every living being to the essence, including the planet. Unfortunately, humanity wasn't prepared to fight back against an invasion of excessively terrifying existence and suffered huge losses. The Corvi race wasn't the only invading race, and many intelligent races Argos, transforming the planet into battlefield between them, leaving humanity as cannon fodder for each other. Humanity tried to fight back, but their weapons were completely useless against these foreign races, as they protected themselves with a membrane of mana. This mana membrane deflected bullets, and even bombing was useless against them. Humanity suffered and had to withdraw to the smallest continent on Argos, also called Canir, with their surrounding archipelago of around 40 small islands. Canir, where most humans are living now, has the smallest amount of permanent rifts, and the permanent rift, fortunately, connected none of the intelligent bipedal race planes with Argos. The only permanent rifts it had were worlds with beasts that invaded Argos quite often because of their wild instincts and desire to massacre humans. Even if they had everything they needed on their own side, these powerful beasts continued their attack, not caring about the losses of humanity, and even they themselves had to suffer once in a while. Meanwhile, the archipelagos had a few more permanent rifts and a huge problem with the overpopulation of beasts. They didn't receive much support from the main continent, as nobody was able to fight these existences head-on. Humanity lost more than 90% of its population that had not a single effective way to fight back except using fire against fire. It took them a long time, but after years of experimenting and a huge amount of luck, humanity was able to handle mana more easily. But they weren't able to control elements as they saw from the other races that also used mana as their main weapon. Some could manipulate earth while others could control water as if it was the extensions of their arms. But humans don't own an innate element they could use their mana with. Rather than a bane, it was a blessing in disguise. Maybe it was luck or destiny, as a young and courageous or more likely naive teenager saved the cub of an invading beast from getting killed. After the cub was saved, the youth was also almost abducted and killed by other humans because it was seen as a threat. This particular cub wanted to protect its savior as it bit instinctively into the finger of the youth, subconsciously forming the so-called soul bond contract between each other with the appearance of bright shining light. Jason stopped for a second and took a few deep breaths before he continued his narration. The whole process about the first soul bond is described in a dozen-sided text, but I will skip most of it. Unknowingly to everyone else, the youth felt a connection between himself and the beast cub slowly building up, and even more importantly, he felt a connection to a certain element. Using mana, he could feel the connection to the cub's affinity, and he was somehow even able to use it to a certain extent. Furthermore, after forming the contract, the youth found out that his constitution increased to a certain extent, and it continues to grow with its bound. Through the soul bond, the contractor's constitution would receive an amplification which influenced everything around the contractor. That was how mankind found out about the soul awakening and soul bond contracts. With this important find, the exploration of rifts to other planes with weaker beasts began. Many other things were additionally found out. For example, not every beast was compatible with each human, but even so, they were desperately trying to gain strength. To find out if a human was compatible with other elements, they created certain relics with the remains of artifacts from the battlefield of other races. As such, mankind could awaken one's soul, which would show what type of beast one could form a contract with in addition to the compatible affinity. Everyone wanted to form a contract with strong beasts, but it was only obvious that these beasts wouldn't just look at their cubs getting kidnapped. A war between beasts and humans started with the beasts on the winning side. Even if humanity was losing out, some cubs were still caught and more humans got to use their bounds elements. Humanity suffered many losses, but they didn't retreat without any gains. They grew stronger with each day passing, while the amplification of their soul bonds increased the overall combat prowess of humanity by a large margin. While only around 1 billion humans were left, they grew stronger and stronger each day. They absorbed the natural mana Argos began to generate since the mana outbreak. Nature and mana worked together against humanity as plants, stimulated by mana, began to grow more than 10 times faster, while the strength of animals increased, the more mana they absorb. This increased the reproduction ability in addition to the strengthened constitutions they received from mana. Evolving wasn't a fantasy anymore, and millions of new races emerged from wildlife, and evolved plants were sometimes even able to achieve sentience, while animals were able to acquire an element affinity. Humanity was forced to gather together in order to build a few fortress-like cities close together in order to survive without getting overwhelmed by beast tides. While the first rifts were the biggest problem at the beginning, the numbers of evolved wild beasts were getting more and more threatening, forcing humans to increase their military power more and more. On Canir 12 permanent rifts exist, while some of them are, ding dang dong, that's enough for today, Jason, your reproduction was good. The school bell rang and the teacher left the classroom. Jason was still standing there with his feeble build, patiently waiting for everyone to leave. He had short black hair and pretty facial features. If his hair were longer, many would mistake him for a girl. With his tender age of 13 years, he still had some childish features, but he wasn't chubby as he didn't eat much. His eyes, however, were Jason's most special feature, as they looked like a dead fish without the slightest trace of life within. A fortune teller predicted that his eyes were the most important asset in addition to his beautiful soul when he was born. However, that was only a dream for the young Jason at the moment, something unattainable one wanted to happen sometime in the future. Jason thought of it as a bad joke because he was born with malfunctioned optic nerves. His mother was said to have special eyes, but he had never seen her obviously. She worked at a big and respected family that was said to treat their workers as if they were part of their family. However, one day an evening years ago when his mother should have been already at home, a butler came over to their apartment with a tearful voice and something heavy in his hands, a briefcase. The butler told him that his mother died during a spar between their family's patriarch and another big clan's heir. Apparently, there were some disputes during a party with multiple important personalities of large families involved, which resulted in the foreign heir getting disgraced and humiliated. The foreign heir was aware of the intimate bond between the servants and the Serres family. As such, he went on a rampage, and it was said that more than 10 servants died before he was finally stopped. It was a disaster, and the whole party was immediately disbanded, and the Serres family was dismayed, filled with anger because of the deceased employees. Having money and the power to subdue small families like the Serres family, the opposite heir chose money to shut down the families who lost their loved ones. Not even the media dared to release any news about the accident that happened. The family-like employer knew about Jason's situation and they offered some help, but Jason couldn't comprehend what happened as he was still a child without any experience of death. The butler gave Jason his condolences and laid down the briefcase next to Jason, where he would be able to reach it before he decided to leave the blind boy alone within the lonely apartment. He didn't even know the name of his mother's killer, only the family name of his mother's employer was branded in his mind. Serres. He wasn't even able to cry, as the wrath, frustration, agony, and sorrow were subdued deep within himself. But how could Jason hate the Serres family as they treated his mother so well before the accident happened? His father was said to have been the chairman of a large company governed by the Federation, backed by his family and other authorities. Apparently, he wasn't scared about anything at all, but that was a mistake. A feud with a certain family he got involved with caused the annihilation of his family and his company's destruction. Only he and his wife were left. His mental situation got worse as he became an alcoholic and gambler who lost a few $100 million credits, amassing a huge amount of debts. His mother told Jason that she left his father before anything could happen when she noticed that she was pregnant with him. The story was clear, but Jason didn't believe her story at all. The Serres family took both of them in, but Jason was suspicious because he had never heard anything else about his father before, while only his mother knew who he was. Not a single picture was taken or stories told, but Jason didn't suffer because of that, as he didn't need a father. His mother was everything he needed. She was grateful for the Serres family and decided to work for them with her special eyes. Who would have thought that her decision would kill her someday? Jason didn't know what her eyes could do, but apparently, they were special enough to bring up a child and herself. The Serres family gave Jason an allowance and the opportunity to enter a decent middle school even after his mother died. For Jason, however, this money wasn't even close to replacing his mother, who raised him up alone with much love even with his eyesight problems. He had nobody by his side and he was lonely in such a dangerous world. Chapter 3: Lonely Youth by Heidesgrain. Being blind and an orphan were Jason's only disadvantages, which many classmates used to make fun of him as he was intelligent, diligent, and ambitious, placing him above everyone else at every theoretical exam. His other senses were exceptionally defined and Jason could survive within Artes City he lived in. But in the age of martial arts and soulbonds, Jason was seen as a parasite, because he couldn't even defend himself against the weakest ranked beast. He had to rely on others in order to survive once a beast breakout occurs. The only thing Jason had were credits. However, credits were almost useless to him as he couldn't do much with them. Jason's living expenses were marginal as he had a cheap and smelly apartment and no appetite since years ago. He could probably live his whole life without lifting a finger, but that wasn't what he wanted. Jason's dearest wish was to see something and to work hard to prevent anyone making fun of him ever again. Another important thing he wanted was to find out who killed his mother. Jason wasn't sure what he would do with this information, but he wanted to know if this mysterious heir was apologetic to have killed someone's loved ones or if he didn't care at all about poor family's losses. Thinking about his mother, Jason was once again reminded that his mother told him something important before she died. Due to her special eyes, she understood Jason's situation somehow as she went through a similar situation. After testing a few things, she told Jason that he might be able to see sometime in the future. His optic nerves weren't malfunctioning, rather there was a blockade preventing the transfer of information and energy from the brain to the eye in the opposite direction. Inside his eyeballs were empty marble-like orbs which were normally filled with mana like it was in his mother's case. However, Jason's were completely empty and thus he couldn't see anything at all. When Jason was 4 years old, he asked his mother why he couldn't see, and his mother told him that there was an empty and lonely marble behind each of his eyes. They wanted some friends and had to fill them with the shining particles that were present everywhere. She showed his son the flow of mana by inserting some of it into Jason and continued her explaining that the mana had to gather inside the marbles so they wouldn't be unhappy anymore. When the marbles would be filled, mana Jason would be able to see. The young Jason was determined to gather this mana inside the marbles, inside his eye to make them happy again. Unknowingly, Jason started to feel the mana around him extremely early on and he led it inside the marbles every day for hours over the course of years. In the beginning, he controlled it crudely into his eyes, which would hurt a little bit, and his mother supported him diligently. After the first few tries, Jason's precision was getting better and better and he didn't need his mother's support anymore. Jason was diligent and trusted his mother more than anyone else, so he continued to lead the mana and fill the marbles inside his eyeballs for almost 10 years now. Normally youths at the average age of 10 children would start feeling the flow of mana and start gathering it to strengthen themselves and improve the rank of their mana core to gather more of it and strengthen themselves. Every living being holds a mana core or something similar somewhere on their body, while almost all humans had their mana core at the abdomen. While humans are born with a mana core, wild beasts have to form them over a long period of time until they reach the rank of a magical beast. The first few commonly known beast ranks are wild, awakened, evolved, unblemished, magical. Wild beasts are extremely weak and comparable to the weakest rank of the human ranks, also called novice. Jason's blindness, which was his disadvantage, had a disguised usage, as his other senses were exceptionally distinct. He began to feel mana at the tender age of 4 due to his mother's story and the exceptional senses he had. Jason had a 6 years advantage over the average children to strengthen himself and improve his mana core, but he used the mana he sensed to gather it somewhere else in order to be able to see. His mana core rank was still at the lowest possible rank, also called the first novice rank, while his brethren were already around the 8th novice rank and extremely close to the adept rank, which would enhance their mana core and strength multiple times. Almost 10 years passed and Jason never stopped using mana for something else as his eyes, which made his body and mana core size weaker than everyone else around him. One's control over mana and sensing ability was an indicator of how fast one would be able to increase the mana core ranking by absorbing and refining mana into it. After the novice rank came the adept rank, and after that, the expert rank followed suit. While the novice rank was roughly comparable to wild beast ranks, the adept and expert ranks were slightly weaker compared to the awakened and evolved ranks because the strength of beasts increased slightly more than a human's constitution. After 10 years of hard work, Jason noticed that the marbles inside his eyes were almost completely filled, and it would only take a few days until he achieved his long-desired dream. His middle school days were also almost over as only a few weeks were left. At the end of middle school, everyone would get to from their first soulbond contract after they awoke their soul. The age of 13 to 14 years was the perfect time to awake one's soul, and after the soul awakening finished, the hierarchy system began its work, dividing talented people and human trash in order to give prodigies a perfect nurturing. Soul bounds were extremely important because one could get elemental abilities from them, and even a part of their physical strength would be shared with the master according to the master's soul. With a good soul bond, one could be stronger than an awakened beast while being at the adept rank, which was normally weaker than awakened ranked beasts. One would get tested about their soul energy, the size of one's soul indicating the number of contracts one could form, and which type of soul one had, or rather said the affinity the soul was drawn to. As previously mentioned, not every human was compatible with each beast. There were a few different types of souls, such as elemental souls with fire, water, earth, wind, and so on. Most elemental souls had only one element, while some rarer ones had two elements. Prodigies had 3 or more, while souls with up to 5 or more elements were called God's children. Having 5 elements also indicated that one could form a contract with at least 5 beasts, as each element would accept at least one beast. That, however, doesn't mean that a single element could only hold one contract. But it was more likely that a single elemental soul was weaker than a soul with many elements. There were also physical souls that allowed humans to hold non-elemental beasts like goblins, orcs, trolls, minotaurs, and many more. Physical souls would increase the shared percentage of strength even more compared to elemental souls, as non-elemental soul bonds wouldn't provide any elemental ability. It could be double the amount or even more. The first contract one would form was also said to be the most important one, as one would share one's whole life with the soul bond. If it died, your soul would be partially destroyed, while it would take a long time to regenerate. Getting a soul bond in middle school was important, as the first contracted beast were either caught cubs, eggs, or younglings from beast breeders. The first soul bond contract would either be an egg or a very young cub, as it was the easiest to gain their trust and improve one's physique slowly as one would get stronger with the beast's maturity. If Jason ranked first place in the C-grade city Artes he was living in, he would have the chance to pick a beast as the first one, which was what he wanted in the beginning. Furthermore, he would have the chance to enter a decent high school, which was even more important. But this wasn't easy, as Artes City, Jason was living in, and had more than 10 million citizens and almost 250,000 middle school graduates this year due to the still increased benefits for giving birth since one would receive from the government. After the cataclysm, humanity lost 99% of its population, but after the baby boom started around 50 years ago caused by the benefits the government distributed, the population reached officially more than 30 billion some time ago. The number was probably higher, but the high death toll, birth rate, and unknown numbers made the calculation more difficult. Jason lived on one of the smaller islands called Asterix, which was already overpopulated by not only beasts but also humans, as it was one of the smallest and cheapest islands to live on. Over 300 million humans lived on Asterix, and the number was still growing. The island had 3 permanent rifts connecting it with other planets and planes. While one permanent rift was situated in the ocean close to the island, the other 2 permanent rifts were connected to low-grade worlds with magical beasts as the strongest ranked beast. Canir was a huge continent compared to Asterix and the other islands, where most people lived on. It had enough space for humans, but they were threatened by wildlife, and it was impossible to live in the wilderness without the support of strong individuals. But the most threatening known fact was that there were many wars in recent years on Canir against the invading intelligent races that began to cross the ocean. On their home grounds, and after 300 years of advancement, humanity was fortunately at least able to defend themselves on Canir. Some cities were huge and crowded due to their safety, while lower-graded cities were surrounded by low-graded wild zones, turning them into a safe vicinity. Cities were protected by advanced defense measures like mana domes, and it is difficult for beasts to invade these spheres without getting noticed by anyone. Nevertheless, nobody could ensure one's safety outside a city, as even the weakest wild zones were said to be overpopulated by wild beasts. Not even the tiniest spot outside cities could be described as completely safe, and most areas with dense and overgrowing wildlife were completely abandoned by humanity. Before the mana outbreak occurred, almost every corner on the land was explored, but now, not even half of Canir was explored, while the islands had only a few large areas that were way too dangerous for the humans living there. Jason wanted to be the first out of the bunch of middle school graduates, but he would need to master the theoretical exam and the practical exam, which was impossible for him to exceed in. The last test was also called the martial arts exam, and it was Jason's weakest grade as he was beaten up every time in school. Receiving 0 points at the most important exam would be devastating and would result in him ending as one of the last ones to pick a beast to form a contract with and only a minuscule chance to enter a decent high school. But right now, Jason didn't care about these tests at all as he focused the mana around him to gather inside his eyeballs. Obtaining a decent soul bond was important, but at the moment, his eyesight was even more important for Jason. He believed that it was the right decision to finish one step after another, and even if Jason started to train his body and mana core right now, it would almost be useless to break into the second or third novice rank as it was still way weaker than anyone else. But being able to see would change almost everything, which was what Jason believed and relied on. Going home the same way as every day with his cane in the left hand, Jason needed almost an hour to arrive at home, if one could call it that. It was a small room with a bed, a fridge, and it was connected to a small bathroom. The worst, however, was that it smelled, and it felt filthy, but Jason felt like the same on his inside since his mother died, so it was quite comfortable. Maybe he would lease a different apartment once he would be able to see, but that was something to think of later. Sitting down on the bed, Jason continued gathering mana inside his eyes like every day until late at night when his belly growled. Opening the fridge, he found out that it was almost empty after feeling around the inside. Jason used the AI of his smartphone to deliver him some bread loaves, sausages, and so on. As it was set to arrive the next morning, Jason washed up and took his clothes off and went into the bed to sleep. A few days later, it was the weekend and Jason sat on his bed gathering the mana around him. He felt that today was the day he has waited for years, and it was the first time for Jason to be excited again, as his heart thumped loudly. The marbles inside his eyeballs were filled to the brim, and Jason's eye and optic nerves began to itch uncontrollably, making him feel extremely uncomfortable. Suddenly it felt as if thousands of paper-thin but also razor-sharp needles penetrated his eyes, and the optic nerves and blood began to flow out of his eyes. It almost looked like Jason was insane, as he cried out in pain with blood dripping out of his eyes. The pain was almost unbearable, and Jason suffered pain he had never felt before, but he had to endure it. Seconds, minutes, after hours passed, the pain decreased slowly. He didn't know how much time exactly passed, but Jason felt extremely exhausted. His eyes, which were previously closed due to the pain, slowly opened, and Jason's previous lifeless eyes were replaced by two brightly shining and vigorous golden eyes flickering in the darkness. Chapter 4: Seeing the Unseen by Hydesgrain. Opening his eyes slowly, the first thing Jason saw was an empty, cracked wall that looked extremely filthy, exactly as he expected. Jason didn't know which color it was as he had never seen any color before, but the color looked old and, in some areas, it was puffed up. The room itself was in a single monotonous color, while it looked like the room was smaller than he had imagined. Over the last few days, Jason researched a lot about human senses with the help of his smartphone's AI, as he wanted to check out if his eyes worked properly after awakening them or not. He noticed that something was not normal, as he could see something he estimated to be the mana flow, which he previously only felt before. Jason was only sure that it was the mana flow as he saw it flowing through him, and the sensation he felt was the same Jason was the most familiar with. He was able to see the mana flow. That was something an average human couldn't do, at least that was what the AI told him. Full of excitement, Jason stormed out of his room, ran down the stairs, and left the building as fast as possible, only to see that it was already dark outside, with a few lamps at the street, lightening the gloomy streets up. Is this darkness the night? It's already so late. ? How unfortunate, Jason thought, visibly frustrated. He felt a little bit down because he couldn't explore the city right now, but it didn't matter, as he was able to see anyway. Jason was still able to walk through the city on the next day, as time was the thing he had more than enough. Looking at his phone and noticed a set of numbers in a white font. He couldn't read the numbers, but the AI told him the time. Yep, it's already night. Nevertheless, Jason was excited. It was the first time seeing anything and everything looked interesting. Jumping around like a small child, it was the first time in years that he was happy and without worries. He matured faster than most youths, and Jason was already thinking like a responsible adult. The worries over his exams vanished by the sight of lights, buildings, and even his smartphone as he grew even more joyous. But he had to calm down, as it was already past midnight, and he didn't want to draw too much attention. Going back to his room, he inspected every piece of furniture inside the building, but his finds were rather disappointing as the whole building looked old and was marked by the flow of time. There were only old-looking and tattered furniture. Even if it was new to Jason, it still looked a little bit disgusting. Jason finally understood why the price for his room was so cheap in contrast to the other rooms he looked up with the help of his smartphone's AI. He laid down on his bed and decided to search for landscapes and colors online, to understand which name was assigned for each color, as he was way too excited to sleep right now. Hours passed and Jason fell into a deep sleep with a bright smile on his face. Waking up after a few hours of sleep, Jason washed up, changed into a different set of clothes, and went outside with fast steps. Before sleeping, he had looked up many landscapes and beasts to get to know what some of them looked like. Jason also looked up information about foreign races that invaded Argos 300 years ago, and he was astounded to see their looks. Some of them looked almost similar to humans in Jason's opinion, only a few minor differences like skin color, body parts, and so on were indicators of a different race, while other races were completely different from humanity with the deterrent looks. A particular race jumped into Jason's view with its height of 4 meters, 4 muscular legs, the lower body was covered in black scales, broad upper body was slightly different with all kinds of horrifying deformed faces plastering it. The head was the only thing comparable to human facial features, but its eyes were that of a lizard, while a bone armor covered its 6 arms. Crystals stood out of its back, which were the race's mana storages. That was almost everything known by the public about this race other than its name. This race was called Gallia, and it was one of the most dangerous invading intelligent races as it harvested and recycled the corpses it killed. Luckily there weren't many of them, but Jason was still horrified, and it was time for him to go to the toilet before he wanted to go outside. Going out for a walk inside the city, Jason primarily focused on the people around him with their either expensive or cheap-looking clothes, makeup, facial expressions, and many more details he could finally see. It was interesting to see the different compostures. Rich-looking people had a confident facial expression and a straight back, while some poorer-looking ones were going through the streets with a bent back, the gaze focused on the concrete. Some people noticed his gaze, and some avoided his eyes while others glared back at him. Jason noted that, and he thought he should stop staring at them as the gazes were uncomfortable for him, and Jason continued his walk until he arrived at a park. At least he thought it was a park as he saw a sign, but obviously, he couldn't read it. With the help of the AI he found out what the sign said, and it was a park as Jason thought. Looking around the park, Jason noticed that there weren't many people within the park right now, but everyone Jason saw had a beast nearby them. These beasts were probably their soulbounds, and it was as if they were going for a walk or playing together. Most soulbound beasts he saw were rather cute and small, looking like normal animals before the mana outbreak. There were many fluffy beasts and also a few beautiful looking ones. But one thing was uncertain for him. Why were these beasts radiating different shining colors? Most of the beasts didn't radiate any color, whereas some radiated a feeble black color. There were even some beasts radiating a slightly stronger light gray color, and Jason wondered what's going on. Jason even saw 1 or 2 beasts that had a dark green light enveloping them, and these beasts were also looking stronger than the other ones without color or black and light gray color radiating. Looking at the enveloping color hurt Jason's eyes after a few minutes, and the enveloped color vanished. Jason noticed that it took a toll on him if he wanted to look at the radiating colors. After these colors vanished with the incoming pain, and Jason noted that the mana flow around him was suddenly more difficult to see. This wondered him, are these colors indicators for the beast's strength or something else, and why does it drain so much of my energy? He felt weak and it took him some time before he could see the mana flow again without any obstruction. Jason noticed that his eyes could infinitely look at the flow of mana as if it was normal while looking at the radiating colors of beasts drained some of his mana. It was as if his eyes had a passive effect to look at the mana flow while it was an active skill to see these colors like in a game. He had heard many things about games as listening to gaming broadcasts was interesting for quite some time until he noticed that he wasted too much of his time for it without gathering mana into his eyeballs. Jason tried this theory and noticed that it was really the case. Subconsciously, Jason could activate and deactivate his ability to see the radiating colors of beasts. The pain his eyes had to endure lessened noticeable, and Jason replenished the lost energy with a constant supply of mana. His control over mana was superior compared to his peers because he had a proficiency of almost 10 years with precise movements in order to not hurt his eyes. Furthermore, his senses were extremely distinct, adding another reason for his superior mana control. One wrong move with his mana and he would have shattered the marble, which he fortunately didn't know. His mother only told him that he had to be careful, and Jason had always listened to her. Seeing these soul-bound beasts, Jason was reminded that there were only around 5 days left until the final exams, and he decided to go home. There was a particular problem he noticed. Chapter 5: Keeping the Secret by Hydesgrain. If the news about his cured eyes came out before the exam began, he would be in more trouble than he previously thought of. Thinking about his cured eyes was delightful, but on the other side Jason couldn't read, and once his eyes were exposed and found out that he could see, he had to write a normal written exam like everyone else, without the help of the AIs saying what's written down on the holographic screen. The problem was that Jason couldn't read and write. He didn't even know a single thing including the alphabet and had to learn it slowly. How should he be able to write down theories about the mana outbreak in a highly technical language? There was no way that Jason was able to learn how to read and write in a little bit more than 4 days, including the important terms. So, Jason made up his mind and decided to fake being blind until the exam ended, or else he had to write the theoretical exam, which would end up with a devastating result, destroying his dream of attending at least the worst possible high school. Another thing Jason could do was to ask the Ceres family for help, so he could reveal his eyes without worries, but he didn't want to do that, as he relied more than enough on this family. He would keep his eyes a secret until he finished middle school and would reveal his eyes when he entered high school, which was still questionable for him. Many thoughts run through his mind. Will I be able to attend a school? What's the use of attending the worst high school in a C-grade city? Should I just start working somewhere? Feeling tormented by his own questions, Jason sighed, frustrated. As for resources high schools provided, the most important reason for Jason would be to learn many martial art techniques and battle skills, but thinking about the martial art techniques provided by C-grade cities, or rather their worst high schools, Jason could only frown deeply. Is it really worth the effort? Jason didn't want to be a laborer, as they were exploited and earned only enough to stay alive. As such, not many occupations could be chosen by him if he only finished middle school. For now, Jason would have to do a few things. The most important thing was that he had to score 100% on the theoretical questions, because he didn't want to have his soul awakening and pick a soul bond as the last student. While the Soul Awakening score was unpredictable, Jason was sure that he would get 0 points for combat technique and 0 points for his Novice 1 mana core and miserable strength. The Soul Awakening was on the same day when one would pick the soul bond, which was the reason it wasn't included in the exam results to decide the order to pick one's soul bond. Even with a 100% theoretical score, Jason would be at most in the middle section, but more likely in the lower section to pick a soul bond, which annoyed him slightly. He didn't want to be blind, and Jason frowned thinking about the unfair world. It was good that his eyes were doing fine, and they were even something special, like his mother told him that seeing wouldn't instantly solve all of his problems. Calming down, he continued his walking around, and his mood changed completely as the skyscrapers around the park looked amazing and Jason marveled at almost everything. Going back home due to exhaustion, Jason bought the beginner book for reading and writing most children would use. Jason used his old smartphone's AI to tell him what he should do, as Jason didn't have someone to read it to him. The AI was somehow replacing his parents' job of education. Hours passed and Jason's brain smoked after completely learning how to read and write every letter. It wasn't as easy as he had expected, and it would take some time to fluently read books, write sentences and texts while applying the correct grammar without any misspellings. Jason was aware of this fact, but he was also very happy. He believed that he would never be able to see and learn how to write as the years passed without sensing any progress in his eyes. Jason's mother told him that it would only take a few years until his eyes would awaken, but she was mistaken, as it took almost 10 years of utmost effort. Nevertheless, he was happy and gathered more mana to improve his mana core and physique, which was more than necessary. Next morning, waking up before his alarm, Jason washed up, brushed his teeth, and put on his school uniform. Taking out his cane and a bandage to cover up his eyes, he left the building. Jason would have to lie about his eyes, saying that he hurt them somehow, to use the bandage as an aid and a means of coverage if someone asked. But nobody really cared about him that much, so Jason would just play low-key without drawing much attention on himself. It would wonder him if someone even asked why he used a bandage to cover his eyes, so he was quite relaxed. Putting on the bandage, he wanted to test if he could see the mana flow through the thin bandage without revealing his golden eyes through it. And surprisingly, it worked. Jason noticed, causing a radiant smile to appear on his face. The bandage was thick enough to cover his golden eyes, but also sufficiently thin to see the mana flow. Jason wanted to know where the mana flow was thicker and where it was thinner to improve his gathering of mana somehow. It would be quite helpful to find some spots where the mana density was thicker, as Jason didn't have much time left to improve his mana core rank. Taking off, Jason pulled out his cane while he was already wearing the bandage, so people at his school would not notice anything off. An hour later, Jason arrived at his school where nobody cared about him. He entered his classroom like every day before and sat down nonchalantly in the first row next to the window. Looking through the bandage around the classroom, Jason noticed the flow of mana around his classmates. Jason could see the outlines of everyone, and he could tell which one of them was stronger in rank and magical power. However, he couldn't really tell what rank they were, as his eyes told him only the differences in their mana core, which indicated the distinction in strength. There was not a sign telling him 8th novice rank or something like that. Most students in Jason's classroom had the same amount of strength, and he knew that most were at the 8th novice rank, so he could allocate the mana core level to a rank. There were a few stronger and weaker ones, but the majority was at the 8th novice rank, which was the publicly known average for middle grade graduates on Asterix and some of its surrounding islands. On average, youths began to sense the mana in their surrounding at the age of 10, while some would be able to sense it at a younger age like Jason. Youth with an average mana aptitude required slightly more than 4 years to increase their mana rank to the adept rank. This was mostly because of the rough start everyone had to go through by learning how mana worked, what it could do, and how to handle it carefully, which was difficult for young children. Unfortunate children started to sense mana later than their peers, which is most probably an indicator of poorer compatibility with mana. There are many reasons why some humans gathered and absorbed mana faster than others, which would result in them reaching higher mana core ranks compared to their brethren at a younger age. These indicators were mostly divided into two main sections, namely called innate talent and trainable talent. The main indicator for every human's mana gathering and absorbing speed is their mana control, which is trainable, and one's mana sensitivity, which was considered as an innate talent and almost impossible to improve. Jason was a negative irregular, while a positive irregular was the guy next to him. Greg Flay was his name, and he was already 14 years old. His parents were merchants, or more likely beast traders. They captured beasts for others and owned a decent number of assets and credits. It was even said that they'll be appointed as minor nobles for their meritorious deeds. Comparing their strength, Jason noticed that Greg had more than multiple times the amount of strength and magical power compared to his classmates. He was most probably already at the adept rank and thus the number one prodigy of their middle school. It was astonishing to see the huge difference from an adept rank mana core to a novice rank mana core. When middle school started, Jason thought Greg was a little bit full of himself, as he defeated everyone with a single punch during the practical lessons, but Jason didn't have any animosity with him as Greg has never bullied him. Rather than that, Greg seemed to be relatively friendly towards him, and since they sat next to each other, Jason had never been bullied again, which made him curious. Did Greg intervene? Was what Jason questioned himself many times during the last few years. Normally it was said that the strong preyed on the weak, but Greg was a rather nice guy, even if he was a little bit dull. His grades weren't that good but also not that bad. But instead of having good grades, he was like a monster in martial arts because he liked to fight way more than anything else. Jason wasn't a good sparring partner and thus probably uninteresting for Greg. Only Jason's grades were envied by Greg, but different from others, he didn't do anything because of his envy. Wasn't it rather childish to envy a blind one for his theoretical grade when he would fail miserably in every practical exam? Sometimes, Greg even asked Jason about some difficult things and Jason answered them before ignoring him again. Class started and everyone sat down waiting for their teacher to arrive. Greg noticed Jason's bandage, but he didn't really care about it. As the teacher entered the room after the bell rang and lessons started like every weekday. Nothing special happened during the theoretical lessons and Jason listened carefully while imagining how everything was written. While the school lessons were divided into theoretical and practical courses, Jason only attended the theoretical lessons because the teachers noticed it was useless for him to have practical lessons after some time. The only thing he would do was running on a treadmill to build up some stamina and listening to the explanations of the martial art technique they learned, some tips, and the finest details of them. For Jason, today, everything was different than usual, because he could see the outlines of the instructor's technical movements according to the martial arts description, as most martial arts techniques were used with the support of mana enhancing certain body parts. Jason scanned the movements and devoured them, memorizing everything he saw. He would try some of them at home and he didn't want to have any flaws during his practice. Other than this, nothing changed about Jason's behavior. While walking home he always scanned the soulbound beasts he saw, trying to figure out what the radiating colors indicated, but there were almost no clues. Chapter 6 Exam by Hydesgrain. The day of the exam arrived faster than Jason expected, but he successfully kept his cured eyes a secret, without anyone noticing him. Over the last few days, Jason improved his knowledge about everything he needed for the theoretical exam and he was confident in getting a perfect score. Jason has always been a smart boy with an insatiable desire to learn more. To be more exact, he hated it when he didn't know something, and once there is something he doesn't know or is unsure about, this thought doesn't leave his mind. Jason also trained the martial arts sequence at home, but it was only partially useful, as he would get beaten up during the exam, even if he tried his best, because his mana core and the corresponding physique was too weak. Pondering if he should just give up the sparring exam or not was still unanswered by himself. However, his reading and writing achievements made him proud, as Jason was able to fluently read books and write some easier sentences. Technical language was still far away from him, but Jason would just take one step after another. At least his secret was kept hidden, and getting a full score for his theoretical exam was almost completely sure. Hoping to achieve a nice feat with his soul awakening, Jason was still slightly hopeful. Awakening his soul was even more important than his first soul bond, as he could also reject an extremely bad soul bond if his soul was too extraordinary or his soul energy too high. If that was the case, Jason had to ponder if he should loan money to purchase a good beast cub or egg at the beast pagoda. But after dreaming for a bit he realized that it was very unlikely for his soul to be something special, as the chances were marginal. Awakening a better soul wasn't directly dependent on the parents' genes, but the chances to awaken a better soul were higher when one's parents had decent souls. Jason didn't know anything about his parents' souls, and he had never seen his mother's soul bonds, which was somewhat suspicious, but every time the young Jason asked his mother about her soul bonds she seemed to be sad and deep in thoughts, so Jason didn't ask her after some time. Nevertheless, Jason was still happy about his eyes getting cured, and it distracted him from frustratingly thinking about his exam score. He began to slowly understand what his eyes could do, even if it was still too complex for him to comprehend. There was only a theory forming in his head. After washing up and changing his clothes, Jason went the same way as every day. He was a little bit nervous, but looking at the flow of mana calmed around him, eased his tension. Leaving the small apartment, Jason didn't forget to put on the small bandage, before he took the cane with him. Arriving at the school ground an hour later, Jason was surprised about the loud noises he could hear. Most parents went to the school ground with their children to support them sincerely. There were a few thousand children with their parents crowding the school ground, and it wasn't easy for Jason to squeeze through, without seeing anything except the mana fluctuations and outlines. Looking at the outlines from the students' parents through the bandages, Jason figured out that the strengths of everyone were completely different. The mana flow Jason saw was also different from each adult, and after thinking for a short moment he figured out why this was most likely the case. Apparently, every soulbond amplified and modifies one's mana slightly, thus the stronger a soulbond beast is, the more distinct are the modifiers and the mana one can use. Jason could also see the modified mana, which surprised him, as he could differentiate the different colors perfectly. He was able to see which adult had formed a contract with a wind ability beast, and so on. This fascinated him, and Jason noticed again that his eyes were extremely special. Thinking about possible fights in the future, Jason would already know what his opponent's abilities were. This thought delighted Jason, and he kept looking through the crowd while walking towards the classroom. Each adult Jason saw had formed a soul bond with at least one beast and accomplished a certain mana core rank. Thus these parents were extremely strong compared to their children, the middle school graduates, and each adult without a soul bond. Probably only after binding a beast, some prodigies would be able to beat weaker adults with weak souls and soul bounds. But right now, even a few hundred Jasons wouldn't be able to beat the weakest adult he saw throughout the crowd. It was comparable to moths flying into a campfire, useless and a waste of one's life. Jason tried to ignore the parents and their cheering as he went into the empty classroom and sat down on his chair, slightly dejected. He missed his mother even more in such situations. A few minutes later the first classmates came into the classroom, hesitating. For most students in the recent era, the theoretical part was the hardest for them, as they trained their muscles and mana a lot more compared to the quality time they used to learn. Jason was calm and composed as he waited for around 15 minutes until the classroom was filled. The last one who came in was Greg, who surprisingly greeted Jason. He even sincerely wished him good luck. This shocked Jason a little bit, and he wished Greg also good luck after a short moment of hesitation. Jason had no time to think about Greg's behavior, as the class teacher entered the room with a special appliance he handed Jason. Jason noticed that the teacher gave him a special VR helmet, which he immediately put on. The other students opened the holographic screen on their tables and the exam papers appeared in front of them. In front of Jason was now the exact same exam papers his classmates had in front of them, as the helmet could send the data into his mind like they were his eyeballs. It went directly into his mind, without the need of him to really see them. The data were enough to provide his brain with the rough pictures. This appliance was extremely expensive, and the exact data sent would only stay in the user's mind for a certain amount of time, before they slowly dissipated. Jason could hear the question by thinking about the number, and answering would go the same way. Thinking about the answer would be enough, and his thoughts would be written down. It was as if the VR device was only a translator for Jason, who started his exam after putting it on. The questions ranged from human cities, beast rankings, habitats, strengths, weaknesses, permanent rifts, temporary rifts, foreign races, strength indicators, common herbs and ores, soul awakening, beast evolutions, and many more theories about the rifts, cataclysm and so on. While others struggled a lot answering the questions, Jason finished them one after another without thinking much. The only thing Jason did in his free time for the last 9+ years was listening to books and gathering mana for his eyes, so it wasn't that difficult for him to answer these simple questions. Jason didn't even actively learn anything, as he was good at remembering things after hearing them once. It wouldn't be surprising for him if he could answer some high school graduation tests, so Jason finished up the exam early. While Jason already finished everything he needed until the afternoon, where the practical exam was scheduled, the other students clumsily answered all questions. As such, Jason left the classroom under the threatening glares of his classmates. Chapter 7: Breakthrough by Hydesgrain. Outside the school building, Jason searched for a good spot as he sat down between a flourishing grass field with a few trees surrounding it. The reason he sat down there was that Jason could see the slightly denser mana flow within the area. This was also probably why it looked so beautiful through normal eyes, but Jason didn't care about the aesthetics right now, as he felt that his mana core was close to breakthrough into the second level. Right now, he was at the first novice rank, which is extremely bad compared to the average 8th novice rank. Because his rank would also be tested and graded, Jason had to break through until afternoon. But this wasn't because he wanted to get more points, rather he wanted to get fewer points deducted. His classroom teacher told him a few days ago that the worst grade to get points would be the 4th novice rank, and each grade less would deduct 20 points. That meant Jason would get 60 points deducted because of his first novice rank, and that wasn't something to be proud of. Each point more or rather less deducted were hundreds or even thousands of ranks up or down in the ranking, and extremely important for him. Furthermore, it would look even worse for him as he wanted to apply for a decent high school. Jason had to calm down before gathering and infusing mana into his core in order to prevent any instability, so he waited for 5 minutes before he started to gather mana. Hours passed, and unknowingly to Jason, Greg and many other students left the classroom to eat lunch and relax before the practical exam would begin. Greg saw Jason from far away sitting between some bushes, and he came closer to take a look. It wondered him why Jason gathered mana so far away from the mana gathering platform, but getting closer he noticed the reason. This mana density is worse than at home, but it's still a lot better than what the mana gathering platform provides. How did he find this? Greg was curious, but he was distracted by his classmates calling his name. They weren't his friends, as Greg didn't have any friends, but his classmates still tried to befriend him for a long time since they found out about his parents' business and fortune. Leaving Jason, Greg was still curious, and he said to himself that he shouldn't underestimate Jason even if he was blind. Jason meanwhile noticed someone getting closer to him, but he didn't feel any animosity, so he didn't disconnect his mana flow gathering as he was getting closer and closer to the barrier of the second level. He calculated that he had at least 2 hours left until the practical exam started, and decided to abandon the practical examination if he wouldn't break through until then. Having fewer points deducted was more important to him than getting a 0 in the practical exam, or instead "not present" written down. This would look slightly worse for his applications, but he didn't care about that, as -60 points and 0 written down were even worse than -40 points and "not present" in his opinion. Unfortunately, he would get his rank tested today and wasn't scheduled for a different day like the Soul Awakening, otherwise, he would have more time to break through his level. Before the Soul Awakening, every student would get their total score tomorrow, as an eye controlled every exam and the queue number for visiting the Beast Pagoda. The Beast Pagoda was where the Soul Awakening orbs stood, which one had to use to properly awaken one's soul, and it was also a shop verified by the government for beast cubs and eggs. Almost everyone gets their soul bonds from the Beast Pagoda, and working there gave many benefits, including discounts, priority, and many more. Jason heard that even Greg, whose parents were professional beast merchants and captors, would get his first soul bond from the Beast Pagoda, as it was the traditional way. That was at least the rumor, but Jason thought it was rather because Greg's Soul Awakening was random and his parents couldn't catch hundreds or thousand different beasts of each rank and elemental ability, only for Greg to pick a single one. The Beast Pagoda was the easiest way with its big variety of beasts. 2 hours almost passed as Jason was fully enveloped with a white film of mana. A crack appeared that began to spread slowly and grow in size as Jason exhaled black mist. This black liquid-like mist he exhaled were his impurities, and it looked extremely disgusting and reeked even worse. Unfortunately, Jason had no time to take a shower or to change his clothes, as it was already time for his practical exam. He stood up, took out his cane, and rushed to the gym. Meanwhile, the practical exam has already started as the students stood around a bunch of machines that would scan one's DNA and blood samples to discover one's health. This was important for most high schools as it was useless to spend important resources on ill people. Most people would see Jason as such a case, but if his soul awakening would be extremely good without further health issues, Jason could receive an invitation to some high school with further help from high personalities. In reality, it was rare for blind students to receive such treatment, as they would need to have special traits or a God's children's soul, indicating one's uniqueness to be worth the price. Also, to receive such treatment one would have to sign a contract to work for the school or organization after finishing school for a certain number of years. Concluding the facts, it wasn't worth it for Jason even if he was still blind. He heard enough stories about such cases, and most naive middle school graduates who needed help from others were rather poor, and after signing the contract they were cured, which was positive, but only to get exploited on the battlefield after getting nourished. Jason wasn't blind anymore, so he didn't even think about signing a contract if his soul would be unique. Youth after youth finished getting blood drawn out and tested, and most of them were happy as they knew that they were healthy, but like every year there were some unfortunate ones who thought they were healthy, only to find out that they had some disease detected which would harm the body later on. Almost every one of them was devastated, and it looked like their soul left their body as they understood the meaning of this. Kneeling on the ground, they cried out loud. Today should have been the best day, but it came out that they would not only get a bad score but also that they had to suffer in the future because of the detected disease. While the students were tested, Jason arrived at the door gasping for air. The teacher noticed him and called his name. "Jason, you're late. Come to me and let your DNA and blood be tested. If nothing is wrong you will get the full points even if you are blind." Jason was used to him getting seen as a blind mole or something like that, but it still annoyed him that everyone said something like "even if you are blind." If he could, Jason would punch his teacher once or twice for each time such commentary came out of his mouth. After taking a few deep breaths, he straightened his back and went slowly to the teacher while swinging his cane gently in the ground in front of him. Getting his blood tested, it was found out that Jason was extremely healthy but slightly malnourished. There was nothing else wrong, and Jason passed the test without any issues as malnutrition wasn't seen as a disease. Eating more would solve this issue easily. Only a slight remark annoyed Jason slightly. Blind. It was annoying, but Jason could apply for a test in a few weeks to get his eyes tested. With a certificate, he would have this remark removed easily. Around half an hour later everyone finished the test while a handful of the few hundred students were soulless, kneeling on the bottom with an open jaw. After the blood test ended, the real practical exam started. Testing one's speed, stamina, strength, martial arts technique demonstration, and a real spar. The average score would be the points for his practical exam. Jason was sure that he would get some points for his stamina, but he wasn't sure if his speed was fast enough to get points as he couldn't run 100 meters straight without external help. Strength should be his worst field among these three, while Jason wanted to try out if he could get some points with his martial arts technique show. Getting 0 points for his weak strength and sparring straight out because he surrendered these exams, some students and even the teacher were displeased. Jason, however, wanted to focus his mind on his stamina, speed, and martial arts technique right now. Some students with slight conception noticed that Jason didn't forfeit the martial arts technique demonstration and wondered why this was the case. A few hours passed and every exam except the martial arts technique demonstration finished. Jason got 2 zeros from the exams he forfeited, 40 points for his stamina and 10 points for his speed because he had to run like he was blind and his bad physique. Nevertheless, it was better than scoring 0 points. Most students demonstrated one of the two martial arts technique sequences they learned at school, which were the foundational Federation martial arts, while the other one was the basic close combat technique from the military. Azure Feisty Ape. Many students got average grades, but their comprehension wasn't outstanding and they made many mistakes which Jason saw through the mana flow. It was almost as if these students tried to mock martial arts, but their score was still above 30, which wondered him. Jason pondered if he should reveal everything he comprehended as he saw the demonstration of his peers. Chapter 8: Exceeding Expectations by Hydesgrain. Jason came to a decision as it was his turn. Going up the stage with slow but steady steps, many students were displeased as most of them were exhausted and wanted to get home. Trash. It's useless. You can't even see. How should you be able to demonstrate a decent sequence of a martial arts technique? That's true. Don't waste our time and come down. Do you want to humiliate yourself, Molly? Exclamation mark. Question mark. Jason didn't care what they said and he waited for the examiner to give him the verbal signal to start. There were many examiners all around the hall and at least 10 other students were also demonstrating their martial arts sequence. Before the examiner could give the signal, Jason lifted one of his hands into the direction of the students who insulted him with his middle finger up. He would never meet them again, so Jason decided to cut ties, without any regret. The whole gym was silent as it was kinda rude to do something like that and adding the situation Jason was currently in, directly in front of the teachers and the respectable examiners, but Jason didn't mind other people thinking bad about him. Flabbergasted. The students who insulted Jason were flabbergasted. WH question mark. Who does he think he is? Question mark. Single quote. As these students wanted to throw a temper, the examiner interrupted them with the starting signal as he ignored Jason's rude behavior. There were always a few students disregarding him as an examiner, and sometimes a few students would fight each other over minuscule things. Jason got into the Azure Feisty Ape standard position with a smooth movement and began to start his understanding of the first sequence he learned. He moved around the small amount of mana inside his body, following the mana channels close to his veins, enveloping his hands with a fractional film of mana without wasting a second. This alone was an astonishing feat because a certain accuracy and control over mana were needed to lead the mana to a certain body part and envelope it like a second skin. Jason meanwhile had to take care of his distribution of mana because the amount of mana he had at the moment was marginal. If his mana pool was larger, Jason was confident that he wouldn't need to form a paper-thin skin-like membrane to cover his fists, which took a decent amount of his focus. Moving around smoothly with his enveloped fists, following the moves described in the Azure Feisty Ape description, Jason began to sweat slowly. The whole area around Jason was deadly silent except for the sound of his own movements, as everyone was astonished by the exquisite sequence of movements Jason demonstrated. Even if Jason had never seen the sequence of the Azure Feisty Ape technique, the first sequence was branded in his mind as he had watched it countless times over the last week. Almost nobody could understand how Jason was able to do it without seeing anything, because it was illogical to know how to move if one didn't see whether the sequence was wrongly applied or not. One move after another was perfectly executed without any mistakes, and the whole show, which looked like a mesmerizing dance, ended after a single minute. This minute was over in an instant and still took an eternity. Jason was sweating buckets, and his back was drenched with it, but his smile radiated the gym. Demonstrating the Azure Feisty Ape technique felt as if he achieved freedom. He couldn't see through the bandages, but it didn't matter as his accurate and smooth movements made him feel ecstasy. His stored mana was completely dried up and Jason felt empty, but this didn't cover his happiness. The examiner looked at Jason slightly astonished, his eyes widened. He had often seen something like that, but not from a blind second novice rank youth with a malnourished body. Does this student have an extreme sensitivity for mana? Exclamation mark. Did he feel the mana flow when the instructor teaches his students, and this youth remembered everything and executed it like that? Pretty good, he thought, but he remained calm and said with a monotone voice, exceeding requirements met, 120 points. Everyone heard the sound of a stone dropping inside him as they heard the announcement. Greg got full marks with 100 points because his martial art technique was perfectly demonstrated, but even he felt that Jason's demonstration was slightly better than his own. At least Jason's accuracy and control over mana were on a different level than his. Nevertheless, it was only a single sequence and nothing special if one worked hard on it, as the requirements were quite easy to meet. Jason himself was even more astonished than the others as he didn't know if he did everything correctly. He had never personally seen the combat technique from the school's instructor and only the outlines were seen by him. But he was happy that he got more points than he had expected. Coming back from his happiness, he was again reminded that his average score was still bad. Calculating a bit, he came to the result that he achieved 34 100ths points on average, which was much more than he expected. Adding the presumably 100 and 100ths points from the theoretical exam, his score was circulating around the average middle school graduate. Unfortunately for Jason, the next test instantly worsened his happiness as the teacher said, "Now that everyone finished the practical exams, we will scan your rank and rate you with points." The examiners stood up from their chair and gathered together while one old man said with a loud voice, "Everyone stay calm, please. There will be an uncomfortable feeling which will invade you, but don't fight against it. We will scan your mana core for a short moment and give points according to the guidelines." A weird and chilly pressure radiated out of the examiner and spread out with him as the center. Invading every student, they began to shiver slightly before the chill left them. Number 1 Ammon Arion 8th Novice rank 60 points. Number 2 Alina Art 9th Novice rank 80 points. Number 3. Number 158 Greg Flay 2nd Adept rank 140 points. Number 2374 Jason Stella 2nd Novice rank, -40 points. As he heard the examiner's voice, he felt a sting in his heart. He knew about deducting points from before, but it was more painful than he thought. His presumably 134 200ths points were now 94 300ths. The last chance for him to get points was the Soul Awakening, and Jason, who was previously relatively happy with his score, was now back down to earth. Everyone was exhausted and the examiner finished his distribution of points. Afterward, he ended the exams and excused himself without looking back. Jason meanwhile went back home slowly without caring for anybody around him. He didn't even notice Greg looking, following him with his curiosity shining in his eyes. It was already evening when Jason arrived at his miniature apartment. Entering the room, he went into the bathroom to shower and then he fell down into his bed, falling into a deep sleep due to his exhaustion. Chapter 9 Shopping Tour by Hydesgrain. It was early in the morning when Jason woke up. Opening his eyes, they shone with vigor as he rubbed them to dispel his tiredness. Entering the Federation network, Jason accessed the middle grade graduation site where he entered his serial number. Looking at the score he saw in front of him, Jason was stuck between multiple types of emotions. Happiness, sadness, and most importantly frustration. Jason received the score exactly as he thought he would. Theoretical exam 100 and 100ths points. Practical exam 34 100ths points. Blood test. Passed. Remark. Blind. Mana core. Second novice rank -40 100ths points. Soul Awakening. Question mark. It was annoying, but Jason couldn't change it anyway, so he entered his mail section and saw a notification about the Soul Awakening, scheduled Soul Awakening. Sunday 2. August 10:25 a.m. Sighing, Jason noticed that the 2. August was still more than 2 weeks away and he wasn't really sure what to do until then. The only thing he was able to do was gathering mana and integrating it into his mana core to improve his rank, as he wanted to be fully prepared for the day he would enter the Beast Pagoda. His theory was still constructing slowly and Jason was expectant to find out if he was correct. Fortunately, his Soul Awakening wasn't today, which was a somewhat positive side effect from his bad exam result, so there was more than enough time for him left. Jason was expectant but also a little bit scared because of the soul awakening and the following choosing of his soul bond were the most important things every youth had to go through. He had enough money to purchase a so-so beast, but he didn't know how high his soul energy would be, so Jason stopped thinking about unnecessary things. Sitting on his bed and gathering mana until lunchtime, Jason's mana core was almost replenished. Somehow Jason felt that the time to replenish his mana was extremely long, but he didn't have any good circulation manuals with good explanations to speed up the process. Before he would get his soul awakening done in 2 weeks, Jason wanted to change a few things which were previously unnecessary. He wanted to change into a decent-looking apartment, bought nutritious food, new clothes, and many more things. As it was still unknown what soul bond he would get, Jason had to wait with the leasing of a new apartment, as the soul bond could be gigantic and thus too big for a small apartment. The possibility was small but still there, and he didn't want to waste time and money. Jason had a huge amount of credits left, but he wasn't sure for how much most things were sold for, as he was provided with his apartment for an extremely cheap price, and he bought bread loaves, instant noodles, and snacks at the market with the help of his AI before he gained his eyesight. He had zero knowledge of how to handle his finances, so Jason had to look up some things online. In the afternoon, Jason finished writing a small list of things he wanted to purchase with an approximate price behind the article name on his phone. Because he didn't want to purchase these things online, he went outside, heading straight to the shopping district. Jason wanted to see everything around him, and it was boring to sit inside the small smelly apartment the whole day without anyone's company. He brought a bandage with him for emergencies, if someone from his class would appear, but he believed they had more important things to do than going on a shopping tour right now. They were probably thinking about the soul awakening and their future soul bond all the time, or lamenting about their low exam scores. A few minutes after leaving his room, Jason entered a crowded street with many stalls on each side of it. Many kinds of stalls were there, including food stalls, clothing stalls, magical devices, stalls about mana resources, weapon stalls, alchemy stalls, and so on. Jason needed many new clothes, food, and he wanted to buy a quantum bracelet that would replace his ancient-looking smartphone. His old phone was already extremely old, but that wasn't the reason Jason decided to buy a new one. The quantum bracelets had a better resistance that could even endure attacks from magical beasts, while his phone would probably be destroyed soon if it fell a few more times out of his pockets, which wasn't an uncommon occurrence. Furthermore, during journeys through wild zones, Jason would have to be fast and flexible, and his phone was too big and hard to allow such movements. This was only futuristic thinking, but still important to think about. The quantum bracelet had also another special feature. Integrated with spatial storage, the price skyrocket for quantum watches. Jason had enough credits left behind from his mother's death insurance, the pay from his mother's murderers, and his allowance from the Ceres family, so he would be able to purchase a quantum bracelet. Because of the integrated storage space, Jason wanted to purchase the quantum bracelet as the first thing. Going around for almost half an hour, Jason stood in front of a 5-story building with a big quantum bracelet sign. The shop looked luxurious, and Jason entered it through the door. An attendant greeted him before noticing Jason's worn-off clothes, causing a frown to cover the attendant's expression for a moment. "Hello sir, are you here to purchase a quantum watch or bracelet, or did sir maybe enter the wrong shop?" Jason felt the attendant's gaze on him and remembered once again that he wore old, worn-off clothes. He understood the attendant's question and didn't harbor any ill feelings against him as he answered honestly. "I'm here to purchase a quantum bracelet. Can you recommend one with decent storage space and a high endurance that can handle attacks from magical beasts?" "You don't have to ask if I have enough credits." He said the last sentence to avoid getting in an embarrassing or awkward situation, and the attendant understood his meaning, even if he couldn't decipher why this youth wore clothes like that if he was able to purchase a quantum bracelet. Taking out a few quantum bracelets, the attendant explained their capabilities with a few simple sentences including the price, storage size, and so on. From 10,000 to millions of credits, everything was included, and Jason, who thought his huge fortune of slightly more than 500,000 credits was enough to purchase one of the best quantum watches, was more than a little bit astonished. Sensing everything at the cheaper priced quantum watches and bracelets, Jason found a black one that met his requirements and seemed to fit well. The Black Demonic Bull 318 quantum bracelet was made out of black iron and certain other materials. It could withstand a blow of a Black Demonic Bull, which was a strength-type magical beast enhanced by a demonification, and the storage space it had were 2,500 cubic meters. The storage device was the most expensive part of the quantum bracelet, as it needed to be made from a blacksmith master with the help of an inscription master and the core of a spatial-type mana core. If Jason wanted, he could get his storage space enlarged, but that would cost even more, and Jason didn't need it at the moment. Spatial-type mana cores were rare, and thus the storage space made up at least 60% of the price. Jason had to pay 199.999 credits, which caused a sting in his heart, but he made a transaction to the shop's bank account before he changed his mind. The attendant was astonished that such a poor-looking youth had so many credits, as his pay wasn't even 1% of the youth's payment. Most citizens were paid around 1,500 credits a month, which was enough to feed the family and their smaller soul bonds with some low-graded food. They couldn't purchase high-nutrition food with this income, but being alive in a C-grade city with 1,500 credits a month was almost a wonder. Jason's expenditure was way lower because he didn't eat much before, and he never bought clothes and other things. He bought necessary things for his hygiene and health and lived in a smelly and hideous-looking room for 100 credits a month. In addition, he told himself to buy more high-nutrition food to fix his malnourished body and become stronger. The price was so cheap, as the building was about to get demolished in a few years, and it was situated in the vilest district inside the whole city. His expenditure was thus less than 200 credits a month, so paying almost 200,000 was way too much for his small and tender heart to handle. Jason thought even if the expenditure hurt, it was required because he wanted to get stronger to adventure the wild zones in order to gain some credits while thinking about his future. He would have to decide soon whether he should attend a trashy school in Artes to learn more about martial arts and knowledge he already knew, or gain credits by hunting weak beasts while improving oneself slowly. Chapter 10 Friend by Hydesgrain. After changing the data from his phone to the quantum bracelet, Jason put it on. It looked quite good, and Jason scanned it with his eyes for a moment, as it was really beautiful. Setting off to buy clothes and other necessities, 2 hours passed and the sunset indicated the nightfall. Jason was at a hairdresser, and he had already changed into some new clothes, so he looked completely different from before. If someone from his former class walked past him, they wouldn't be able to recognize Jason even if they looked at him throughout. Suddenly a voice call was transmitted to his quantum bracelet, and Jason saw an unknown number. Slightly curious, he accepted the call with a, "Hello. Who is this?" A familiar voice answered him. "Hey, here is Greg. I'm having my soul awakening in half an hour, and I wanted to ask you if you want to spectate it. It might be weird to ask you this, but I thought it might be helpful for you to sense how a soul awakening works, so you understand what you have to do when it's your turn." Jason was astonished, as he has never been called before, and thinking that Greg wanted to help him was also slightly difficult for him to comprehend. But thinking about Greg, Jason noticed that Greg never treated him badly, and he himself was also very curious how a soul awakening takes place, so he accepted his invitation. "That would be great. I can be at the Beast Pagoda in less than 30 minutes. Please wait for me." Jason ended the call and ordered a shuttle, which arrived a few minutes later. Entering the word, Beast Pagoda, an address appeared, and the shuttle went off. 15 minutes later the shuttle arrived in front of the gigantic 5-tiered pagoda, which looked ancient. He had never seen a pagoda and didn't know if this size was normal, but it looked very expensive as he saw the mana flow radiating from the building materials. Thinking about the pagoda's ancient appearance, a sudden thought appeared in his mind, and he searched through his storage space. Luckily, he found a bandage which he put on before leaving the shuttle. Jason has almost made a huge mistake, but luckily, he thought about his eyes which he couldn't reveal at the moment. He had to wait at least for a week or probably a little bit longer until his soul awakening was before he could reveal his cured eyes so his theoretical exam would remain valid. Jason called Greg because he didn't know where to go, and less than 2 minutes later someone with a strong presence came outside. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Stella? Master Greg is waiting for you," an old voice asked, and Jason concluded that it was the butler from Greg. It was quite weird to get called Mr. Stella by someone, as he has never been called by his family name. Following behind the old man, he was astonished about the butler's strength. Comparing the butler's strength to the parents he saw yesterday, he concluded that the butler wasn't normal either. He was questioning himself how rich and powerful Greg's family business was, if their butler had already this kind of strength. Jason had an easy time following the butler, as even stairs weren't a problem because the materials inside this pagoda radiated a certain amount of mana outlining it. After walking for a few minutes, the butler stopped in front of a door with dense mana radiating out of it. In front of the door stood a few people, and Jason detected Greg's mana signature among them and a few stronger mana sources. Especially the 2 mana signatures next to Greg were special. He had never seen such a huge amount of mana anywhere, and he opened his mouth slightly in shock. Seeing Jason with an open jaw in his direction, Greg's theory about Jason's sensitivity for mana was answered. While stepping forward, he greeted Jason, who came closer. "Jason, you're here. How are you? Since when do you have new clothes and a new haircut?" Greg was a little bit astonished about Jason's handsome look, as he had never expected that a good-looking boy was behind such trashy clothes. He would never say this out loud, but he looked after Jason many times in the past because he found Jason was nice and didn't care about other people's background. What Jason had long since forgotten was that he had helped Greg sometimes out with some remarks on how to learn certain things better. Greg wasn't sociable and quite naive, but he was sure Jason was a good guy, which was also the reason he wanted to help him slightly with his soul awakening. Jason greeted Greg back and turned his head slightly in the direction of his presumed parents. "Hello, my name is Jason Stella. Am I right with my presumption that you're Mr. and Mrs. Flay?" Jason bowed lightly. Even before the mana outbreak, respectful greetings and manners were only important in some regions of Argos, but they got more and more essential after the mana outbreak occurred with the coming rules of the jungle. Strong people could almost kill whoever they wanted outside the cities, while the government protected the weak with their best efforts. Even murder and rape happened inside the cities once in a while. Sometimes big families took care of the matter, like it was the case with Jason's mother, and most weak people tended to be as respectful as possible and avoided the strong. As long as the government was weaker than these big families and clans, they had to partly rely on them to protect the majority against the wildlife and intelligent invading races. Fortunately, not many big families were of evil from their core, and only a few members in some families were driven by the desire and bloodlust. It wasn't that difficult to keep them under their control normally, but once they fight against their control, some uncontrollable things are bound to happen. Greg, however, was slightly stunned. "How do you know where my parents stand?" Exclamation mark. Greg's parents were curious about the boy in front of them. They saw a blind boy, but they felt something strange about the area around his eyes. Nevertheless, what surprised them the most was that Greg brought a friend over to his soul awakening. Greg was more of a troublemaker since elementary school than someone who made friends, so they have never seen one of his friends. Being curious, the 30-year-old looking woman with a small build and silky brown hair stepped forward. "Hello Jason, my name is Gabriella Flay and I'm indeed Greg's mother. I have never seen one of Greg's friends, so it's nice to meet you," she said before chuckling. Jason found himself in a weird situation. "Is Greg my friend?" But there was no time to think about that. Greg's father was apparently embarrassed and he pulled his wife back before introducing himself shortly. "Hello, my name is Mark Flay, Greg's father. Nice to meet you." His father's introduction was slightly cold. Maybe he thought Jason wanted to befriend his son because of their money, or Jason's blindness could be the reason, but he didn't mind it. Jason felt a threatening stare and noticed that it was the outlines of an almost mature girl standing close to Greg, but sensing her mana core he was slightly shocked. Remembering the mana core rank from the adults in front of the school grounds a day before, he noticed that this girl's strength was one of the best. Greg has a sister. Or is that his girlfriend? Never mind that, but why is she glaring at me like that? Question mark. Before the conversation went further, the door with dense mana enveloping it opened slowly.